Recognized 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for their outstanding testimony and their expertise. As China expert and former Defense Department official Michael Pillsbury has written, the CCP is entering the final phase of its 100-year marathon to replace the United States as the world's global superpower. An underappreciated dimension of this strategic competition between the United States and the CCP, and one of the reasons why the CCP is arguably ahead of schedule in that marathon, is the CCP's economic aggression against the West. But I believe very strongly that the United States should not mimic the Chinese industrial policy, should not copy the Chinese command and control system. We should not embrace overly broad measures that would raise questions about our commitment to a market economy, which is a key source of strength for the United States in contrast to China's communist central planning policies. In other words, as this committee does its work and as we consider policy responses to the threat from the CCP, I would submit to my colleagues and to policymakers in this country, we should not try to counter China by becoming more like China. Mr. Pottinger, though, I do believe there are certain areas where we need strategic, targeted, focused, and tailored decoupling. And that strategic, targeted decoupling should be limited and focused on national security issues. So to that point, I want to set the stage for those watching tonight on the risks of U.S. investment and Western capital flows into Chinese military surveillance companies that do threaten our national security. To what extent are American investors, through these emerging growth index funds, public equity exchanges, and even private equity and credit investments, either knowingly or unknowingly, investing in Chinese companies that directly threaten U.S. national security?
Congressman, it's a huge amount of money. I point you to the work that Roger Robinson has done in this area. He's a former Reagan administration official who's been actually trying to tally the amount of money. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that have been flowing to opaque firms, many of them involved in grotesque human rights abuses, including genocide and slavery of the Uyghur people and others. And I think that most Americans don't know. If Americans knew that that's where their money was going, they would say, I'm out. What are you talking about? But I do think that there has been poor stewardship of the money on the part of these index providers and, frankly, on the part of a lot of big money managers who have not paid close enough attention to where that money is truly flowing.
Well, let's talk about the appropriate and tailored and focused response. What is the policy solution here that is consistent with our values and our general commitment to cross-border capital flows? What is the right policy response? So as you consider that response, talk to us about disparate lists within the Department of Commerce, the entity list, the lists within the Department of Defense, the so-called 1260H list, and also within Treasury, the OFAC list and the Chinese military industrial complex list that is subject to these executive orders. Is the right policy response a very surgical, direct OFAC sanctions regime that would not only tell American investors, green light, red light, these are red light companies, but it would coordinate that sanctions regime with our entity list at Commerce so that a company that we should not be transferring technology to through BIS should also be on the sanctions list so that outbound capital screening, outbound capital flows are not subsidizing or investing in companies that are a technology transfer risk. And one final point, does OFAC have a multilateral effect so that non-U.S. investors are also not funding the rise of Chinese military surveillance and technology companies?
Congressman, to start with the last point, I think that when the United States leads, our allies sooner or later tend to follow. That was the case when the Trump administration put the first ever sanctions on China for their genocide. The Europeans and others slowly began to follow suit. There's no substitute for America's deep and liquid capital markets. No one else can substitute for the massive liquidity that we provide through our capital markets here. So the answer is, when we're talking about an adversary, a totalitarian adversary that does not wish us well and is involved in the worst human rights abuses so far this century, yes, we need to actually begin coordinating and at least trying to study why it is, for example, that the U.S. Commerce Department has 1,000 Chinese companies on its export control list because those companies provide dual-use military technologies. But at the Treasury Department down the street, there are only 68 companies that Americans are prohibited from investing in. 68 companies that are either affiliated with the Chinese military or involved in gross human rights abuses. The number should probably be several tens of thousands of companies, not merely 68. So the Treasury Department has a lot of explaining to do.
Well, my time has expired, but obviously coordination of these lists is critical, and I yield back.
Mr. Luke Meyer is recognized.